we mentioned a little bit of this before, but I mean, in the US, it's still common to receive an opioid prescription from just going to the dentist or for chronic back pain. So this was just like taken to the extreme. And there is work that shows that the quality of your medical school is going to predict how much opioids you prescribe. So there are some determinants of like what makes a physician more likely to prescribe opioids, and like the quality of the physician is. Sorry?
It was interesting. So the quality of the medical school you went to, I guess, by ranking something, there is at least some correlation between that and the level of which you'll prescribe opioids.
Yes. So doctors from better med schools prescribe lower rate. Their prescription rates of opioids are lower.
Wow, interesting. And obviously, the correlation doesn't mean causality, but that is an interesting correlation there. Like if you're going to, maybe these doctors that are from better medical schools, I guess you would assume better trained, and so they just understand the consequences of these drugs a little bit more, and they're a little bit more knowledgeable about it.
I think that's like the story that that paper is trying to tell, and maybe there's also a little bit more of so like these physicians are also all the time receiving trainings about new drugs, and maybe the understanding of the conflict of interests in when Purdue Pharma comes and invites me to a conference in Hawaii about like their new drug developments, and like how should I really receive all of that information with a grain of salt? Like that component of like continuous training may also play a role in terms of like the quality of physicians. And now I don't know where we were talking.
Oh yeah, no, my apologies. I completely cut you off. No, I think we were getting into some of the essentially there was evidence essentially from these unreleased files that doctors that were treating cancer pain essentially were being targeted specifically, which again is a little bit more normal. But then as it went on and as the marketing increased, it started to spill over into the more general public.
Okay, yes. And now I remember. So you were telling me, how did I start thinking about all of this? And the answer was like, I was interested about this other thing, which was child neglect and child maltreatment. But then in trying to answer that question, we were like, okay, we first need a measure of exposure that is somewhat exogenous, that is driven by the decision of Purdue Pharma, and not by the local decline of a community that then may seek pain medication. And so when we saw this story about like how it was really the influx of pills was a function of the size of the cancer pain in the past, we're like, well, we have this exposure that is really supply driven. And so we're like, well, maybe we should just first tell the story of like what are the broader economic consequences of the opioid epidemic, rather than like the maybe like smaller, or like maybe not necessarily smaller, but like very specific question of like child neglect and child maltreatment. So like we should tell first the story of like how this really changed the economies of those places. And so that's what we did first. And we saw that these places were becoming poorer. So there was greater dependence on welfare. The people in these communities were also more dependent on disability. And so when we were presenting this work and talking about like the economic hardship that was induced by the opioid epidemic, a common question that we were asked was like, well, and what do you think are the political effects of this shock? And we were like, well, I have no idea. Your guess is the same as good as mine. And so we wrote that paper, and like, well, maybe now that like that paper is written, we should, like, the natural next step, because it was the natural like follow-up question that everyone would have, was like, are there any political consequences of this? And it was like, it's natural to think, because there was just like such a large economic effect, but there is no intuition of like which way it should go. And so when we looked at the data, it was very clear that basically the same separation that we saw in terms of like places that looked very similar before the onset of the opioid epidemic, and then higher cancer places that were just that received massive influx of opioids, those places were turning towards the Republican Party at a much higher rate. And so we wrote that separate paper, and when we did that, like there was like a little. It took us some time to be able to explain how come is it that then the Republican Party is benefiting from the opioid epidemic. So ultimately, we ended up like, right, we have two papers that then became one, and it became one because we think that there are three important things that determine the effects, the favorable result for the Republican Party. But the main thing is going to be that it created economic hardship of white working class Americans. And during this period, the Republican Party was really campaigning on the economic hardship of white working class Americans.
Yep,
and
sure.
This is like in the broader, like there are other things that are happening that made this the case. And for example, everything related to trade and how openness to trade led to the decline in manufacturing employment and slower growth in wages and so on. Even though this is something that was something that the Republican Party was campaigning for many years and led to the approval of NAFTA and all sorts of trade agreements. It was the Republican Party, the one that started to see the hardship that some white working class Americans were enduring, and that a lot of this hardship was not like the result of like their own decisions and their own failures, but that it was something that was just like there is a change in the economy and the environment in which like firms hire and the types of jobs that are available. And so they saw that gap in this is a story that is not being told, is not being acknowledged. And the fact that the opioid epidemic just like created more of that same story made then the increase in hardship for this specific group of people something that was favorable for the Republican Party. So then that's why like both putting like the two papers together made sense, and how like first telling the story of like how this really changed communities in a way that was very detrimental for their subsistence, and is specifically white working class Americans that were most affected by that. And then during this period that this is starting in like the mid 2000s and late to 2010s, this is the slogan in a way of the Republican Party. So their experiences are being acknowledged in a way that the Democratic Party was not doing so, and maybe was just speaking about or recognizing the hardships of other groups, of marginalized groups, of racialized groups. That, I mean, it's also valid, but they was just like not seeing that the hardship of this specific group. So that's one reason I think all of this was favorable for the Republican Party. But we also document two other things. And the second is, which is also very interesting, is that we look at the coverage of local newspapers by their political leaning. So liberal versus conservative leaning newspapers. And what we find is that conservative leaning newspapers were talking about the opioid epidemic at a much higher rate than liberal leaning newspapers. And when they were reporting on this, was a function of what was happening in their local communities. So they were like, again, like they were more in touch with what was happening in their local communities, and specifically in the experiences of the opioid epidemic. And then on top of that, they were also framing the opioid epidemic around issues that were favorable for the Republican Party. So then also bringing a little bit of a discussion on illegal drug cartels and the fact that many of these are going to be from immigrant countries, and the Mexican cartel of heroin, or Colombian drug cartels. So also like bringing a little bit of other topics that are in general favorable for the Republican Party.
Yeah. or drugs being smuggled across the border in Canada as well, and, and all that stuff.
Exactly. And then the last thing that I think also made this favorable for the Republican Party is that a lot of the harm reduction policies that have been put forward to deal with the opioid epidemic, and which are more like liberal leaning or that have been pushed by the Democratic Party, those haven't been successful. So, for example, in Oregon, there was the decriminalization of drugs, and that was a huge disaster. And they actually went back on those policies because it increased the number of overdose deaths. Another example is syringe exchange programs that have also increased overdose deaths. And then we show that there is a distaste for these harm reduction policies, to the point that places that have higher rates of exposure to the opioid epidemic see lower lower support for marijuana legalization ballots in the US. And so there is it's like a rejection to these harm reduction policies that are more liberal leaning. And what people want is just law and order, which is not to say that there is any success about law and order and increase the number of police officers in dealing with the opioid epidemic. But there is an alignment with the policy response that the Republican Party is putting forward, and a distaste for the policy responses that the Democratic Party has put forward. So I think that is those three things. So that it created economic hardship for white working class Americans, and that was something that the Republican Party was actively campaigning on, even if not talking about the opioid epidemic. But they were talking about how the forgotten America and the America left behind and the opioid epidemic fueled that. So that's one thing.
And I suppose and to your point, interlinkages with some of their other policies, border policy, particularly with regions that have sort of illicit drug activity and all this kind of stuff, probably elicits more of this kind of linkages as well.